Okay, well, we've still got a few people joining, but I think we should just get started with my preliminary remarks. Welcome everyone to Weekend's third in our roundtable series. It's a series on empowering community to become engaged with local governments and elect climate champion councils. The title of this third roundtable is Perspectives from the Inside. My name's Dave Thompson. I'm one of the volunteers on Weekend's local government team, also a consultant with Policy Link Research Canada and a climate-focused candidate in the Victoria 2022 election. WeCan is the West Coast Climate Action Network. We work to support, serve, amplify, and promote the multitude of climate action organizations and initiatives in BC. Before we get started, I'll just read out a quick land acknowledgement, and I would encourage everybody to put your own local land acknowledgement into the chat. As we gather today, we acknowledge that the land we now refer to as British Columbia has been home to diverse Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Since BC was colonized in 1858, local First Nations have faced discrimination, violence, displacement, and cultural erasure. The West Coast Climate Action Network recognizes the right of BC's Indigenous nations to assert and implement their Aboriginal title rights, treaty rights, and right of self-determination and sovereignty as peoples within their traditional territories. We aim to foster a welcoming and respectful gathering place for Indigenous climate leaders who are working on similar issues, where we can come together to build and exchange knowledge and experiences to guide us into the future. For my own part, I live and work in the territory of the Lekwungen people, whose land was taken away from them through the so-called Douglas treaties, which were unclear at the time, signed in dubious circumstances, and never honored by the Crown. I'd be happy to discuss those further with anybody who wishes to. As we all know, one of our responsibilities is to minimize our impact on this land, and climate change is already having a major impact. Climate action needs to be accelerated at all levels of government, including municipal. Municipalities do have the authority and ability to take climate action, and we can, and the local government team will be doing a number of things in addition to the roundtable series. And here I'll just suggest, Sebastian, that we do a screen share of the WeCan website just to show people around very quickly. And I think we can also paste in the website into the chat. Sebastian, do you want to narrate as you take us through a quick look at the website?
Sure, Dave. So this is the West Coast Climate Action Network's website. As always with Zoom stuff, my Zoom buttons are in the way of what I want to do. So let me just move those there. Okay, so at the top, you can see we've got a couple of options here. We've been listing climate action events across BC in our events section. So if you take a look there, you can filter through events. We put out a weekly newsletter, which some of you I'm sure are getting and came here through. And an online version of that newsletter can be found by clicking on the newsletter tab. It's got lots of interesting information, articles, actions, different things you can get involved in, different things you can sign on to. We also have a number of sections on our website for the different initiatives that we're working through right now. So for instance, we have a transportation series, a series of webinars on Indigenous perspectives. And for the sake of this webinar, we can focus on the local government button because we are putting this event on through our local government team. So here in the local government section, you can see we've got a red scary counter counting down the time until we get to the next election, which is going to be a super important one here. And then you can see we have our featured roundtable, which is this one right now. As soon as this is over and we upload the video, we'll replace this with a video. And similarly down here, we have a featured resource being a campaign process guide that we've put together. And then at the bottom here, we also have a button to register as a climate champion. So we're putting together a bit of a database of climate champion candidates in order to help connect candidates with groups in their area to sort of provide mutual support and make sure that we get as many climate champions elected as possible. The top here, you can also go to our old roundtables, as well as some other resources that we put together from groups like Climate Caucus, which we have some representation here today on amongst our panelists. And yeah, like I said, the roundtables, you can see our previous two roundtables. which some of you have probably were at. One was on recruiting climate champions, and another was a bit more broad about how climate groups can influence local governments. So I put the website's address in the chat, and if you'd like to check it out when you get a chance.
Excellent. Thanks, Sebastian. And I'll just carry on here, and we'll hopefully get underway shortly. Feel free to get in touch with We Can if you want to learn more. First, before we get going, a few announcements about how the discussion is going to work. The agenda is basically each presenter will take 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a moderated discussion amongst the presenters with our MC hosting that. And then we'll have participant questions and answers. Please feel free to use the question and answer button on the at the bottom of your Zoom. If you have trouble with that, we do also have the chat, and we will be recording the meeting, as Sebastian mentioned. So today we're pleased to have a great panel of conversation leaders. Our great MC, Nadine Nakagawa, and three speakers, Laura Dupont, Alison Gu, and Rick Lockenburg. Many thanks in advance to our panelists and our moderator. Their bios are on the website where you saw this announced, and just to avoid taking up any further time, I won't read those out to you, but I will ask each of the speakers and our MC to briefly introduce themselves. So Nadine, if that's okay, I'd like to turn it over to you at this point.
Yeah, that sounds great. My name's Nadine Nakagawa. I'm a city councillor in New Westminster, which is the unceded territory of the Halkamenim speaking people. New Westminster is also known as the Royal City. We're very proud to be the first capital of BC. And part of that pride was eliminating any visual or historic references to the nations whose territories we're on. We very thoroughly made that history invisible. So it's our work to rebuild relationships with the nations whose territory we're on, and to uphold the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, as well as I'm wearing these earrings tonight. The murdered and missing Indigenous women calls for justice are still outstanding, and there are municipal calls that have not been actioned, I don't think, by any municipality in Canada in a meaningful way. So we'll just name that to start this off, because we can't talk about climate without talking about Indigenous knowledge and the history of colonialism. I identify as a mixed race woman of color. I'm a settler on this territory. I'm also a renter, which I think is important to mention, that when we're talking about municipal issues, that this is a majorly underrepresented group. First off, I'm going to introduce Laura Dupont. So Laura is a councillor in the city of Port Coquitlam, and I know her first and foremost to be a very enthusiastic champion of trees, and I think trees need more champions. But Laura, tell us a little bit more about yourself beyond that.
Okay, thanks, Nadine. I really appreciate that. So should I just go ahead with my whole thing for the evening? Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm zooming in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nations people, land that lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Coquite, Squamish, and Stolo nations, what us settlers call Port Coquitlam. I'm looking forward to this evening's discussion and working together to tackle the greatest challenge of our time. I am Laura Dupont, a two-term city councillor in Port Coquitlam. I'm also the president of the Lower Mainland Local Government Association, and I've been a member of Metro Vancouver's Climate Action Committee since its inception, and a member of Canada's Climate Caucus. I'm also a big tree advocate, as Nadine said. I have been super fortunate to grow up in the beautiful foothills of southern Alberta, in the Sheep River Valley south of Calgary. I was what you might call a free-range kid, booted out the door in the morning and back inside when it got dark. My sisters and I would roam all over the place, and I was always drawn to the constantly changing river. Swimming in it in the summer and skating on it in the winter, spending time near a river, you get to see and learn a lot about nature's processes and the diversity of wildlife in the area. I have always felt a strong connection to and a deep appreciation for nature. When you pay attention to something, you notice how it changes over time. The last 20 or 30 years, I've really noticed changes that worry me a lot. And these are the things that keep me up at night. Declining bird species that I see in my backyard, changes to waterways, a lot less salmon in our creeks, and drought-stressed trees and plants. Has anyone else noticed the decrease in bugs, worms, and snails? Walking around my community 25 years ago in the rain, you couldn't help but step on a snail or see worms everywhere. Now it's harder to spot them in our heavily urbanized communities. This feels like a big red flag to me. Too many of our weather events now feel extreme. Our region has certainly had more than its fair share of catastrophic flooding, and every summer brings more fires and a corresponding decline in air quality. Last June, over 600 British Columbians died during a heat dome event. Preventable deaths that I can't forget about, nor should any of us. The climate crisis has become a public health issue, and as a politician, I feel a strong sense of urgency. I feel a need to push for more meaningful climate action, and honestly, after 8 years of working really hard in my community, I don't feel like I've been able to move the dial very much at all. In December of 2019, Force of Nature did a presentation to our city council and many others in the region to get support to declare a climate emergency. Our city chose not to do that, and as this image shows you, I tweeted my frustration to the world. That tweet dropped me straight into a big pot of boiling water, and I feel like I've been in it ever since. After 8 years of working to strengthen our tree bylaw, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and tackle food insecurity in my community, I have made very little progress. Was I wrong to tweet that? Maybe. But to be fair, I was speaking the truth, and really, I'm just reading the signs. Speaking of reading signs, I'm not going to lie to you guys. Politics can be a blood sport, but it shouldn't have to be. A lot of people are working to fix the problem, and I want to give a big shout out to the warrior women elected to New West City Council for pushing for real solutions for problems with conduct. It's a terrible place to be put in when you are in political competition with each other and you're also tasked with overseeing each other's conduct. I remain hopeful the province will consider a future Office of the Integrity Commissioner or similar body for local government. Everyone deserves a safe place to do their work. It is, however, very important to know for people who are considering throwing their hat in the ring this October, local governments exist in a very gray area where there is little to no support if things do go sideways. City workplace policies don't apply. There are no parties or unions to defend you. WorkSafe and human rights legislation do not apply to us. You need to know you have to build your own networks. One of the most positive changes I have seen is the numerous groups who have come together to build networks of climate activists and experts, obviously the groups that are here tonight. These groups are an excellent source of resources to support your work to push climate policy forward. You never have to feel alone. A staff champion is extremely important. Build relationships where you can. They will serve you well in the long term. Look no farther than your community. Retired scientists and politically engaged citizens are a goldmine for knowing where to find information, for backing you up with letters to the editor, and for bringing people to packed council chambers when it's time for an important vote. Another place to find shared values is the Lower Mainland Local Government Association, which is one of 5 area associations within the Union of BC Municipalities. It is here and Metro's Climate Committee where I found the support to make a difference. The accomplishments that I lacked at the local level, we have more than made up for at the regional level of government. Metro Vancouver's Climate Action Committee consistently pushes hard for us to get higher targets and tighter timelines to reduce emissions and get to net zero as a region. They have been, I am proud to say, respectfully relentless. The Lower Mainland LGA is prolific at collecting and shaping solid climate policy that more often than not gets supported at UBCM and goes straight to the province for funding support. It's a bit being like in a maze. If you hit a wall, you turn around and find another way to get the work done. To wrap up, my key points are: first, nature has a story to tell us. We are wise to listen and wise to work with nature as opposed to against it. Second, nothing is ever worth it. Nothing in life is ever easy that is worth it. And climate policy is a classic example. Find your way, don't let wrong turns stop you, and most important, don't ever stop. Third, find your people. If our species is going to have a habitable planet in the future, we are going to need all hands on deck. Finding community wherever you can will support you to get there to make the meaningful change we need to see. Thank you everyone for the work you are doing. You all give me hope.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. And I have so many questions I want to ask you following up, but let's move on to Allison. So Allison, you were elected in a by-election, so it's been a whirlwind since then. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before you go into the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a presentation. That's okay. My name is Alison Gu. I am a Burnaby City Councillor. I was elected on June 26th of 2021. And I was elected on the mandate of climate justice, housing justice, and racial justice. I am a second generation Chinese settler on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking peoples. Should I just jump right into it, Nadine? Okay. So I mentioned how I was elected on this mandate. I was also elected with the BCA, which is the Burnaby Citizens Association. It's a municipal party, and that has had a complicated and long history within Burnaby politics, both good and bad. For those who don't know, Burnaby had 2 decades of a council of BCA majority, at times an entire council that was BCA. And that level of power, I think, got to the previous mayor's head a little bit. And there became a lot of issues around transparency, democracy, the way that things were run, both at this council level and politically. And it really became a big issue for the community when a town center of ours started to have a plan for development, and a lot of low-income renters were being evicted out of their places. And I think all of the buildings that were torn down and continue to get demolished were purpose-built rentals that were built back in the 1960s. And so they were extremely affordable and in rentals in perpetuity, which is not something that is commonplace, as many councillors here know. And so now we have some policies in place to protect those tenants, to give them rent top-ups for when they have to relocate, and give them, most importantly, the right to return to a unit at the same place when the building is rebuilt at the same rent that they were paying. So that's a whole history around BCA. I chose to run with them because they had, after they lost the mayor, completed a strategic revisioning and kind of reestablished the values that they stood for. And it was important to me to be in a place where I could hold councillors accountable to those values of reconciliation, affordable housing, climate action, equity, just to name a few. And because there was this erosion of trust and democracy in over time, I felt like it was really important to be on the inside and to do what I could. It's been 8 months since I've was sworn in, and I have accomplished a couple of things. The first thing I did, with the help of Nadine, was to pass a motion on requiring an equity lens when the city of Burnaby establishes climate policies. I also got a cycling motion passed, which was to expand and accelerate the phase 1 of our cycling network and specifically focus on establishing safe routes to schools to fix the kind of problem that we have where developers build a cycling path, but then it isn't completed because it's slated for development, and they're called orphan months. They're quite dangerous for cyclists and disincentivize cycling. And then the third thing that included was better connectivity to SkyTrain stations. So in terms of getting things done, I think I'm in a unique position where there are 3 other colleagues of mine who are in the same party. And getting them on side with some of the more progressive climate stuff that I'm trying to push has been really challenging. But it's also been helpful at the same time. It means that I only need to get one other person to support it. Importantly, thinking from a macroscopic point of view, as much as it is important to have, key people that you go to and can trust to be strong voices on climate, it doesn't matter if at the end of the day we can't get a majority to pass a motion at council. And I think that's important for organizers to understand we've got to be going and organizing around the people who are constantly swing votes and constantly need to be pushed to do the right thing. And as well, it means that I've seen pushing internally has meant that I've seen a lot of movement on my colleagues' own initiatives around climate. And this is really important to me because there will be councillors who are privy to being in spaces that I'm not. At the Metro Vancouver level, at UBCM, at various levels of government or regional governments of some sort. And it's not healthy for one person to be considered the only representation of an issue. For example, if that person has to leave office or doesn't get reelected, we need to be ensuring that work continues. So even though it is difficult and exhausting, I'm hopeful that it is slowly leading towards change. One good example was when I had raised issues in August about our demolition diversion bylaw, which is trying to divert waste from buildings that get torn down. I did some homework and looked at how other municipalities structured it, and a lot of them have, US has it structured, I think, by a dollar per square foot amount, which is not just equitable, but it also helps to incentivize an equitable amount of diversion. What they were proposing was flat rates. Even though the first time I brought it up, it was unsuccessful, and people said, don't worry about it. It's gonna go. You don't want to slow this work down. Then the second time the bylaw was read, my colleague Sav Dhaliwal put forward a motion actually to refer it back to staff to have what I had provided feedback on in August. Another example is on housing. So I am constantly bringing up how we need to make sure that what we're securing for renters, especially those who are apply under our tenant assistance policy with new buildings coming in and being quote unquote dem evicted, they need to have, and non-market needs to have the same unit sizes as strata and other market rental prices. And after bringing this up multiple times, my colleague Pietro Calandino actually joined me once in asking for the streamlining of sizes between strata and non-market rental. And there wasn't a motion on it, but the fact that he brought it up as well as myself was enough to actually get staff to pay attention and negotiate it within the next rezoning. So the next rezoning we saw had all the size of units the same, no matter if you were in a below market rental, a CMHC median rental, market rental, or a strata. And that probably wouldn't have happened if it was just me as like, and I hadn't tried to work on my colleagues internally as well, because I provide a lot of feedback on issues. And I think sometimes staff just say, you know, oh, she's at it again, being critical of what we're doing, and it can be challenging. So I think that's another reason why, as difficult as it is, I have tried to work hard internally to push it, which doesn't preclude me from externally expressing my disagreement with certain votes, which I have done. But it's also been important in getting to certain folks who I don't have relationships with, because I was elected in a by-election. There were pre-established relationships that councillors had with each other, and there will always be pre-established relationships. But being able to press on one person as a lever to then press on another person who has more sway has made a big difference. I'm going to skip through some of the stuff that I was going to talk about because I'm running out of time and I'm talking so quickly. But in terms of general tips on changing minds from the inside, first thing I have is be strategic in how you push. Sometimes you need to be really tough on a stance and unwavering on a stance. Issues like anti-racism and equity, I do not negotiate on. Other times you do need to negotiate, and sometimes something might be in the works that's going to change outside of your control. For example, upcoming provincial changes to municipal authority that would make that what you're working on easier to pass. So timing is also really important. And having outside voices who can influence councillors is really important. For organizers as well as councillors on the inside, it's important to understand kind of a power map of who has influence over the people that you need to sway in certain issues, and in certain kind of, when it comes to issues around reconciliation, for example, who has the ear of the individuals you need to change the minds of. And my third is that I'm a big believer in how powerful community organizing is. When communities are activated around an issue, that allows you to get something done that you might not be able to get done internally. And developing and maintaining good relationships with community organizers and community groups helps you to be able to work synergistically towards your common goals. And because often the public doesn't have access to some of the conversations that are happening on the inside at council and vice versa, having a good relationship is really important in that. For the community organizers out there, I think email campaigns are often the lowest barrier and kind of first steps that people take towards getting folks activated on an issue. And I would say that, having worked for 2 federal MPs and a provincial MLA, email campaigns are probably more effective at the local level because we're the ones actually reading our own emails as compared to staff. Same goes for phone calls. So don't be afraid to follow in those steps that have been laid out very clearly. Second tip would be Burnaby specific, which is that public can't speak on just any council issue. You have to come in as a delegation. So work with your councillors that are allies to be able to effectively create motions from the floor, because these are typically successful since they often refer the issue to staff, and because councillors don't want to vote against a motion where public has come to see a presentation on and people have spent time working on a presentation. And so you can word those motions strategically and have somebody ready to move and second those motions to be able to actually bring community issues to at a council level. Third, I'll say is that public hearings are really great opportunities to get folks out. Typically, of course, this is the avenue that people just generally use to oppose a certain rezoning or development. So this forum can be limited, but it can be a really helpful way to allow councillors to hear directly from tenants and to hear about tenant protection and renters and how renters have a voice and need to have a voice. And then two more. First is consultation on various policies can be really, really helpful forms of organizing. Like, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. In Burnaby, for example, right now, there's engagement being done at various levels on zoning, densification, a food security policy, urban villages, how the city did on the heat response, traffic calming, and most importantly, policies. So I think this can be an undervalued way to organize around. And there's definitely inherent barriers to this way of organizing, don't get me wrong. But I do think that there's not a huge level of engagement typically with these policies, and so staff are really wanting to hear from folks and what their feedback is, and we can use these as paths to organize through. And finally, if you are really struggling, a lot of councillors care about how they're represented in local media on an issue. So if you can work to get media coverage, I know it's harder than it sounds, but get local media coverage and allies with local newspapers to strategically bring pressure to councillors to vote on something. I think that is more true in local government than in other levels of government, and how much media has on sway. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Allison. I was going to say, harder for people to vote against it unless it's POCO, right, Laura? But that's a story for another day. Rick, tell us what's going on over in Nelson. What's going on for you guys?
Okay, hey everybody. It's so good to see on the list of so many friends. It's so wonderful to reconnect with you all. So my name is Rick Lockenburg. I'm a city councillor in Nelson, and which is the traditional territory of the Sinixt people. And we border the lands of the Syilx and the Tanaha. So I was pretty excited about this panel and the conversation that we can have. So I'll try to keep my presentation shorter so that we can have some discussion. But I love the focus on the upcoming election that we have coming, and maybe to have this opportunity to inspire some ideas or some enthusiasm towards running or supporting candidates who are going to run. And then once you get in, to have a good understanding of the potential you have to get things done. So I do have a bit of a presentation. Let's see if I can. Nope, I can't. So I won't show my presentation unless, Sebastian, you can enable it. Otherwise, not that important.
You should be able to do it now, Rick.
Okay, thanks. Desktop to share. There we go. Okay. So I've been playing around with this, this metaphor lately, because it's one that I've thought a lot about, and I'm having trouble hitting play. Oh, doesn't matter. You can see it. So Archimedes, the great philosopher, scientist, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the world. Powerful idea. Levers and leverage. And I think in the context of government and local governments, it's so powerful. And if you're looking to make change, it's really good to understand or think in the terms of leverage and levers. So for those of you who don't know, a lever is there's three different kinds of levers. This is one of them. Where you have a fulcrum, then you have your base, and then depending on the position on that fulcrum, you can move big masses and get a lot of things done. And this is, I think, a really important metaphor when you think of it in terms of using a lever to make change, but then also using that lever to build a bigger lever. And I want to talk about, from my own experience, what that looked like, and maybe that'll inspire some people to think of it in terms of their own lives. So again, this would have been easier if I could hit play, but for some reason this thing's blocking me. Anyways, you can see it. So the first point of engagement in climate action, in my opinion, is personal. There's often this conversation about, personal change doesn't matter because these are systemic challenges. And unless you're, dealing with it at the high level, the impacts we have in our personal lives don't matter. And ultimately, they're going to be erased by the big fossil fuel companies or national or international policy. I have a different view. I think that we need to start by looking at our own behaviors, our own habits, because that gives us a lever in terms of our moral authority. So whenever you then try to do anything around climate action, there's always going to be in the back of the person's mind who you're talking to or who you're trying to convince. They'll be saying, I bet, like, oh yeah, what have you done in your life? Why should I listen to you? It's generally an excuse not to do anything. Nevertheless, if you can answer that argument, you've got a powerful leverage over that situation to create some change. So I do really think it's important. One, you'll also feel more confident. So when you're thinking about local politics or local government or making a change on a global scale, I recommend it's a great place to start. You can use that to then lever yourself into a community group and to become a leader of that community group and inspire your compatriots in that group to more action, to more inspired action. Now, as a leader of a group, you then can leverage that position to become a community leader. The door's open to you. When you send an email to a counselor, they're going to read that email. They're going to take it a lot more seriously, knowing that it comes from somebody who's really active and effective, a leader in the community. So that position, and I've seen, many of my friends in Nelson use that position as leaders of their groups really effectively. So, traditionally that would have been the Chamber of Commerce, that would have been, the local sports community or what have you. They tend to have they send an email or they make a call, the mayor will pick up the phone and listen and take them seriously. I think this is the opportunity for many of us to really own our positions as community leaders to start to affect change at the council table and amongst staff. So then once you become, and you can also use that as a strong base to run for council. And so that's the next leverage point, the next lever. You get onto council and you start to have a potential for a much bigger impact than you think. Not only can you start to impact policy, and if you're really effective at the council table, influence your other councillors to create some pretty big change, but your reach goes much beyond your own community. The local governments in Canada, at least, are highly networked. And so one of the things that when I was first elected, within a couple of months, I really started work on organizing something called Climate Caucus. And just using my position as a councillor, I had access to a bunch of other councillors from around the country, and we began to form and start to network together. From that position, we were then able to have quite a bit of influence on provincial or national policy. That would be the next leverage up. I recommend so strongly for us as elected leaders, and for many of you who are not elected leaders, to really encourage your elected leaders to use their power and their leverage as elected leaders, networks together to influence provincial and national policy. And good news, they know that. Many of them do through the UBCM or FCM, through Climate Caucus. Many of the big changes that are happening in the province, the positive changes, have come in part from local elected leaders connected together, leveraging that position and that connection to impact provincial policy. Now, the next step up is national policy. And this is another thing actually that local elected leaders don't realize, that some do, when again, network together, the impact they can have on national policy. And at Climate Caucus, for example, we organized a number of cities to unite, and then we were supported by a number of supporting cities to unite to become interveners at the Supreme Court of Canada on the carbon pricing case. And we were successful on a really tight margin. We were able to help influence Canada's national policy around carbon pricing, which had a huge impact. And so those are the kinds of things that leverage can do for you. And then finally, there's also the opportunity to leverage that kind of those kind of successes into influencing international policy. So increasingly at the international level, in Glasgow, for example, and in COP in general, local governments have a stronger and stronger seat at the table. So the race to zero and the city's race to zero, as a part of the UNFCCC, is a place where a lot of local governments are pushing national governments to take stronger and stronger action. So this whole concept of leverage, I think, is something that we should really embrace. Always be looking for the impact that we can have at the level we're at, but really also thinking about how does this level and what do I need to build a bigger lever to influence the next level up. So something I've been thinking about. I thought maybe this is a frame that you might find useful. And I think I'll leave it at that because I recognize that we're kind of running short on time. So I was going to go and talk about the Nelson experience, but I'll leave that. Nadine, back to you.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I mean, I do want to hear about the Nelson experience, but okay, we'll save it for another time, maybe later. So I want to go back to something that Laura sort of brought up. So Laura, I don't think it's any surprise to name, I think everyone read this, that you sound frustrated with the progress that you've been able to make at the local government level. You gave some ideas of what maybe would help in the future. Can you say anything else about what would have made it easier for you and what would have helped, either within like your municipality or within the public sphere, or even sort of as like Rick has talked about, or else like Allison's talked about campaigns and projects, and Rick has sort of talked about like anything that would have made it more helpful for you to be able to be more successful in your municipality?
Oh, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think, just more citizens being engaged in the process, in meetings, in what's going on in the community, I think is really super important, because I think the more eyes and ears that are on the work that we do, the more grounded we kind of stay in the community and the more connected we are with them. So, it sounds really simple, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I think it really, that would be one of the solutions, I would say. And then part of the problem sometimes I feel like is the community charter. It's super subjective, a bit vague, and up to interpretation. So there's a lot of that I think presents problems as well. But yeah, more people watching what's going on and talking to your city council, mayor, and council, I think would be a big part of helping move us in a better direction. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think it's been particularly difficult, the past couple of years too, because we haven't been out in the community just bumping into people as much either. So that has really been a big pitfall. Allison, I wanted to ask you something that you named, which is around equity. And you talked a lot about housing and whatnot. And so you and I both talk about the need for equity in climate work and climate justice as a different frame even than climate work. But a lot of people don't know what that means. So can you say a little bit more explicitly what you mean when you talk about equity and how that shows up in policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So for climate specifically, everybody knows that climate change will disproportionately affect people, and those who are systemically most marginalized will be impacted worse by climate change. So one really great example, I think with equity, we all often need more staff resources to accomplish the things that we want to achieve. So one really great example, going to Laura's favorite topic of trees, is trees. Why are areas that are lower income neighborhoods typically less comfortable to be in, less treed, lower in safe infrastructure like sidewalks and cycling networks? Part of that reason is because in the aspect of trees or other aesthetic things, the city is of the belief that residents are more likely to take action and be empowered to take care of the trees that are planted in their neighborhoods, even though it's on city property. Whereas in lower income neighborhoods, they say, you know, people aren't going to take care of them, and we're going to have to pay for staff to go out there and water them. And, you know, like, that should not be a barrier to everybody not having equal access to green spaces and nature. So I think that's just a really simple example of how equity often needs to be pushed, and it often requires an additional voice to challenge what is status quo and what staff are used to doing.
Thanks, that's such a good example. Yeah, that's such a good example of how it plays out in municipal policy as well. Rick, I just wanted to follow up on an idea that sort of came to mind for me while you were talking. So, you know, and you and Allison both sort of talked about ways that you can, if you have an issue that you care about, how do you go about uplifting that issue, right? And something that I think about a lot is, you know, there's some people who have more savvy around that, more ability to reach out because of time or knowledge. How can we help, either as elected people or members of the community, uplift voices that maybe don't sort of have the savvy to do that, or aren't thinking about that in the way? I just think there's so many important issues that maybe you hear about, maybe not in the coffee shop so much anymore, but, you know, maybe on a Facebook forum or something like that. Is there ways that you as a city councillor, or within that sort of framework you presented, that you can see an opportunity there?
Yeah, there's a resource at Climate Caucus that I absolutely love, and it's called the Infiltration Manual, or the Youth Infiltration Manual, but it's a guide to local government for young people, but it's for anybody. But the idea is to really pull back the curtain on how local government works, which is really empowering for people if they start to see that it's complicated, because there's lots of interests and there's a lot of responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But once you start to see and understand some of how that works, you do feel more empowered. And I really think councillors should make it as a part of their mission to reach out to those marginalized groups with a tool like the Infiltration Manual, go to schools and just put it in front of them as much as you can. And then invite them to something like the Committee of the Whole to make a presentation on something that interests them. I have found that once you've made that, you've broken the ice on that, you've done one thing, you felt it wasn't that scary, then you really kind of unlock a lot of enthusiasm and opportunity for marginalized people to step into the process.
Yeah, I think that's such a good resource, and Sebastian just linked it in the chat too if people want to go take a look. It is a really great manual. Something I just want to ask you folks is about, all of you, maybe if anyone wants to chip in, unpacking the lingo. I feel like we've dropped a lot of lingo here. Like you just said, Committee of the Whole. Allison said UBCM earlier. Ooh boy, that's a lot of lingo. And I think about how exclusionary sometimes it is, that we're just yammering away and I'm like, got it. But we often don't use words that include, like, how are you folks thinking about that? How we invite people in? Because I think often in this invitation in, when you know stuff really well, you don't even notice, you know, a little bit. So maybe just an invitation to any of you, how you're thinking about that.
I can take a stab at that. So first off, I feel like for anybody who's interested in municipal politics and interested in running, don't be ever discouraged by not being familiar with process or with lingo, because there are staff whose sole job is to help you with process. And a lot of people, even councillors who have been, you know, elected for 20 years, when they're chairing meetings, they'll say, oh, do I need a motion for this? How should I proceed with this? So that's one thing. The second thing is that process is sometimes used to delay or stop progressive action, and I think needs to be kind of better utilized by our communities, and better educated in terms of councillors to the public, councillors to prospective candidates. And so open up those dialogues with people who are interested in running. Ask folks who are allies about any questions that you might have, but don't be intimidated by it at all whatsoever, because they're just words. They don't really matter. What matters is that you have the values to stand behind your ideas, and that you're interested in learning as much as you can about how to make a difference for people and the climate.
Thanks, Rick. Did you have something you wanted to add there too?
Yeah, I would say that I've learned a lot from presenting to young people, middle school kids in particular, because they don't allow you to use any lingo. You try it and you realize how ridiculous it is and how often you may use it. So that's good training, I think. And then beyond that, I think as a part of the campaign process, to look beyond the usual groups that are going to get votes, and maybe work harder to schedule meetings. And the other thing was door knocking. Actually, I found that canvassing was a really good way to get training and speaking like a human being. So I really recommend doing that.
Fooling them to believe that we're human beings. Imagine that. Yeah, I would sort of layer on to that. I think it's always important to name that it feels exclusionary because people built it to be exclusionary, that if people think that they're not smart enough, they don't know enough to run, then that allows all of us to say, oh, well, I guess I better stay here forever. So if you feel that way, that I don't know enough about the process, I don't know the lingo, I don't know what they're talking about, please do recognize that that's an intentional move by the people who set up the system to keep a lot of us out. So it feels important to name that. So there's a few questions in the chat about working with staff. And I think this is a really good question. It's something I think about at senior levels of government too, that's a bit invisible to the public, is that a councillor brings us motion, yahoo, here we're doing this bold thing, and it never comes back again. Or we give clear direction and it comes back in a different way, or whatever it is. Laura, what's your experience been working with staff? Like, is there sort of that push and pull? And how big of a role in steering the ship do council have versus staff in your experience?
Ooh, that's a really loaded question. I'm going to be really frank because that's how I am being this evening, and why not? I think staff have a lot. The people working in our city halls and in every city department, they have a fair amount of pull, I think, and just even with the recommendations that they bring forward through the reports that they send to council, they can really steer things in a certain direction if they want to. So I was of the belief before I got elected that mayors and councillors were the ones that make the decisions and shape the city. I don't believe that anymore. I think we, it's a bit delusional to think that, and staff have a lot of sway.
Yeah, they absolutely do. But one of the things that I'm excited about is something that I feel like I've learned from Megan Curran, and I think Megan's on the call. Hey, Megan, which is being relentless and also having a consistent framework. And it's something actually we've been working on, developing a framework that if you apply consistently, relentlessly, over and over again, staff start to have to adapt to you, because they know the questions that Laura's going to ask, or Allison's going to ask, or Nadine's going to ask. They can anticipate it, and so they start to write. And then if you push back on the answer they give you, then they know the next time, well, I have to do more research on this, and you start to, I believe, change them. And I think Megan's had an impact on her staff. I feel like the council in Nelson has really evolved by this sort of relentlessness of our questioning and pushing them, because they're good people. They want to do the right thing in most cases, and they just need to be, it's hard to change a habit. Yeah.
Something I will say there too is that sometimes staff have absolutely the right intentions to do the right thing, but just don't have the capacity. And something that staff are consistently asking for is more staff hiring, funding to hire more staff. But where that funding comes from is property taxes. And politicians don't ever want to increase property taxes because they fear not getting reelected because of that property tax increase. So like a couple ways to tackle that is being creative with forms of revenue that can be applied in an equitable way. And secondly, to continuously advocate for the funding that staff needs and to better educate the public on what those property tax increases actually mean. Because oftentimes, even if the general increase is like 3%, that doesn't mean that there's any dollar increase in an individual's property tax rate. So, you know, that's an important thing that politicians have like the control over. But I will agree definitely with everybody else is that staff have a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting point. That's really it's quite complicated, and I think it's different in every city too. The relationship between staff and council, and I think also between mayor and staff and council is also unique to municipalities too. I don't think it's generally it's not as broad-based experience always. There's a question here. I think it's a relevant one as we're moving into municipal elections in 2022. There's a question about party slates. And I guess maybe, do you have any, did you run with a slate or a party? And what's your experience been with that? Do you think it constrains the ability to do work, or do you think it helps? Maybe Allison, you ran with a party. So what was your experience? And do you think it constrains or helps?
I think in some ways it levels the playing field by a lot, because parties have the ability to fundraise in ways that individuals who might not be well connected or wealthy don't. And that's an important aspect of parties. On the other hand, parties themselves can be very exclusive, and it can still come down to a race of who knows the most people, and a popularity contest when it comes to nominations of who gets to run as representatives of those parties. So I think when a party structure is designed and really fairly, and there are a number of checks and balances in place, let's say voting nomination races as a ranked ballot or a proportional voting system of some sort, that can help alleviate kind of the popularity contest issue of it. But I would say in the context of fundraising, it really helps. Like if I'm a single mom who doesn't have time to fundraise and learn about all of the administrative processes of submitting my forms and papers, having a party structure in place and that institutional support is really, really helpful and can be a huge way to break down barriers, but it needs to be done in a really thoughtful and important way.
Thanks, Allison. I think that's a good amount of nuance, because I think I framed it as good or bad, and it obviously isn't good or bad. It's both and more. Laura, how do you think that we could get climate champions elected, as well as more diverse candidates? We know that the Mayor's Council, I think it's 23 municipalities, 20 of them are, I think 19 of them are cishet white men. There's 3 women, and I think 1 First Nations person, because the Tsawwassen First Nation sits on that council. It's obviously not diverse enough at any level. The Mayor's Council is particularly bad in Metro Vancouver, but no council, I think, fully represents their community in all the diverse ways that the community shows up. So how do you think that we can support both climate champions, but also that diversity that will be better for our community?
Absolutely. I think, flowing from the last conversation, a fair and equitable process. I think slates have their value, even though sometimes they're taboo. I think they are a bit taboo out here in the Tri-Cities. But if we're really honest with ourselves, I think slates happen, maybe just fly below the radar and aren't really obvious. So I think slates can be a great way to support a group of people who may not feel well known in the community, may need to share resources. Even just kind of banding together to campaign together is building a bit of a sense of community and bringing an approach to running that I think helps support everyone who's involved. So I think slates are quite valuable when it comes to getting more diversity on councils. Plus, it's not just enough to be elected. As we know, you need support when you are in council and sitting on those seats and making decisions for your community. it's not just enough to get elected, for sure. Also, I think, there's a lot we can do with bylaws in terms of election processes and signs and things like that to make things easier for people who, maybe don't have as much resources to run. Some communities combine flyers that they send out in a group to everybody in the community and that type of thing. I think those are great ideas to help encourage more diversity and people who might not feel like they have the time or the resources to step up and run themselves.
Yeah, those are great points, Laura. Rick, something I think about a lot is how, obviously as the climate crisis hits us more and more, it's very prevalent in our day-to-day lives, like the heat dome was last summer, like the floods were. But often climate's kind of high level for people against the really pressing issues of, like, let's say, I can't afford rent, or I need childcare for my family, or I need to be able to buy good food. How can we talk about climate in ways this coming election that might translate to people's day-to-day life, rather than sometimes, I think, framing it on a high level? Like, do you have thoughts about that? How to make it really accessible for folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing we think about a lot. In the Nelson Next plan, so we developed the climate plan. It's called Nelson Next, and it's envisioning the next 30 years with the kind of intermediate milestones of 5 and 10 years. But in the communication of it, and so much of the work we did wasn't how to communicate it. It was trying to make it as relevant as possible to people's day-to-day lives, and unite or combine the decarbonization side of it with the adaptation side into a general frame about resilience. What we're trying to do is create a community that's resilient and responsible and will bring everybody along. And in many ways, whether you're trying to reduce building emissions or transportation emissions, you can at the same time really deliver on other values. So in transportation, it's a perfect example. Transit is it's a general affordability solution. It does, and depending on the community, it creates more accessible options for people to live outside of the community and have really good transit that brings them into the community if they can't afford something in the city. It also just in general creates, if it's done well, a more dynamic and diverse community. And I think people, when they start to hear that vision about the community or the city that we're trying to create, that does, is more livable, it's more affordable, while at the same time also being more resilient, and bonus, it's decarbonized as well. I think that's had a good effect in Nelson. The response to our plan has been really positive from people you wouldn't expect, actually.
Great, I got to take a look at it after this. Yeah, that sounds like a really positive way to talk about it, like at a level that that people might understand.
Mm-hmm.
What other advice do you have? So if a candidate's saying to you, somebody comes to you and say, hey, Rick, can we go for coffee? I want to run in 2022 on a climate platform. What advice would you give to them?
Absolutely do it. and certainly get a few, your confidence is what ultimately I think will help you win, like your ability to speak confidently on the issues. And so, yeah, doing your homework and understanding how local government works, because I think I've seen a couple of campaigns really just get sunk when they were at the public debate or the town hall meeting or whatever it was, and they just got stuck, and you could just see the fear in their eyes because they're like, oh my God, this is really obvious and I don't know what I'm talking about. And it's complicated, but you should know the basics at least so that you can be more confident. So I really recommend doing that. Like learn as much as you can about the basic workings of government and the issues that people will care about. So if you get stuck with a question you don't really have an answer to, you can confidently say, I don't know, that's a great question. And you can then move to talk about something that you really want to talk about. So, yeah.
Yeah, something I've recently learned too is apparently there's like a Knowledge Network documentary on the Nelson election because there were so many candidates one election, and so yeah. I've yet to watch it, but apparently there might be some learnings there too.
Well, there's two things. So that's a great one. It's pretty good. I think anybody would enjoy it. But there's also a book by one of our counselors wrote, Surviving City Hall, Donna McDonald, And I recommend it. It's probably in your library. That's what I did. That was the first thing I did. I got Donna's book and I read it, and then I felt more prepared for sure.
Great. Laura, what advice do you have for somebody who's running in 2022?
What I think works in our community, just because of who we are, is just get out there talking to people. We're okay to door knock now. I think most people are fairly comfortable with it, and if they're not going to answer their doors. So I would just encourage people, if you're really, really interested in doing that, running for council, just get out there and get on everybody's doorsteps, contact everyone you know, and spend every day chipping away at that. It's pretty basic, but really it's the most important thing. And you can spend a lot of money on fancy leaflets and signs and all those things, but it's the direct connections to people, I think, that gets you elected. And I just want to quickly say, voter turnout for local elections is always just so abysmally low, but it also is an opportunity to get elected. So I kind of like to tell people that, I don't want to say it's not hard to get elected, because it's a lot of work, but low voter turnouts can be a bit of an opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Laura. Alison, what advice would you give somebody who wants to run in 2022?
I think some common, like preparing your responses to some common issues that someone might consistently paint you as being opposition to in when they have an issue that they deal with in their city. So I'll give an example of that. So somebody says at the door, well, if you care about climate change, I'm not voting for you because I want bigger roads so I don't have to sit in traffic all day. And you can go and say to them, yeah, you know what? I absolutely care about traffic too. And I completely understand that there are people, whether it's because of mobility issues or because of where they have been priced out to live, that they need to drive to get to work. But when we allow for more choices for the folks who can get out of their cars, that means less traffic for you as well. And that's a climate issue, but it's also all of these other issues that I also care about, and I think it sounds like you care about as well. We don't need to, we can be climate champions without making it seem like it's this completely polarizing topic that people don't want to vote for, because oftentimes climate solutions, real climate solutions, will benefit people across the board, even if they don't necessarily think that climate is a priority for them.
Thanks for that, Allison. I just want to comment on a couple of questions in the Q&A as well too. There's some questions about sort of systems, I think, to get better people elected. Like one is suggestion of award system. And then there's another one that's a question about salary. And what I can actually say is that there's research done by one of our colleagues, Casta Thomas in Smithers, and it's about actually salary for elected officials actually was a really top reason why people have difficulty staying in this job. It's also gendered, and we know that actually Climate Caucus, I think it's something like 19% of all city councillors across Canada are women, but Climate Caucus is over 50% of the Climate Caucus is women. So I just want to comment that I do think that there are these really real solutions. Salary is something that no city councillor ever wants to speak about publicly because the public loves that, but it's a really good question. The ward system is another good one. The city of Vancouver has done some research and looked at that. And they've actually looked at it around representation. And one of the findings is that it doesn't actually increase better representation. I'm talking about diverse representation, but also recognizing how hard it is to campaign in cities like Surrey and Vancouver and Burnaby as well, that they're massive cities. And so it mandates people who are fairly well connected or are able to connect with parties. So just wanted to talk about a few of those questions in the chat, because I think they're really good questions when we're thinking about brainstorming ideas to get better representation in all the ways that we deserve it at local government tables. Just moving into wrapping up here. It's hard to be hopeful right now, right? Like, I just feel like it's one thing after another that's sort of like, oh my gosh, we can barely look at social media because it's just so heavy right now. So just want to finish on a note of, what makes you feel hopeful these days? Laura, maybe I'll put it to you first. What is giving you hope right now?
Well, thanks for that question, Nadine. You know what? I don't mean to put pressure on our young people, but they're the ones who make me feel hopeful, because wow, are they ever stepping up to show incredible leadership. I tell this story all the time, so it's getting to be probably a bit ad nauseum, but it's important. At our climate committee at Metro Vancouver, the sustainability teams came to talk to us, and they said that our generation is destroying the mental health of their generation by failing to deal with the climate crisis. And that was like such a gut punch for me, but it was an important thing to hear. And those words are never going to get out of my brain. So I would say our youth make me feel hopeful. They are the ones who are leading the way with so much of this important work. And I just think they're gonna, I don't mean to put pressure on them, but I think they're the ones who are gonna make a difference. And I'm just so grateful for all the work that they do. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I remember the Union of BC Municipalities in 2019, which is where all the municipalities, all the mayors and councillors come together, and it was in Vancouver. And we walked out from having votes on climate where people voted to widen highways and all that kind of stuff, right into the climate strike. And if there wasn't sort of like a moment of thinking, and we had voted on declaring a climate emergency and all these things, and we had folks, certain types of folks in particular, arguing we need wider highways, we need this, we need that. And then you walk out into 100,000 young people who have organized for their futures. Yeah, there was nothing like it. It was so moving. Rick, what's giving you hope these days?
I think it's the S curve. And by that, I mean the innovation, the way innovation happens. Like imagine how fast we adopted the iPhone or smartphones and those kinds of things. And I think that we're on the verge of some sort of massive social change. Like I had glimmers of it. A pandemic, I think, is a complicating factor, and it's throwing things off a bit, but it feels like we're on the verge of some sort of major transformation. On the flip side of that S curve of like dramatic catastrophic change is also happening in the environment with tipping points and so forth. So it's like this race for us to transform while ahead of the climate transforming and tipping over into a new state. So, but that's the hope I've got right now.
Thanks, Rick. Allison, what's giving you hope right now?
I think relationships with other people, community, and relationships with being out in nature always recharge me and give me the hope and remind me what I'm working for. It's been really difficult the past couple years to have the nourishing aspects of community organizing with the pandemic. And I think with the weather getting nicer and ability to move things outdoors, and people having a hunger for connection, I think that what gives me hope is that we can really use that opportunity to channel it into building strong movements, people-powered movements that are justice-centered and that help us create and fight for the future that we need and we deserve.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Allison. You're also succinct. I mean, I thought politicians were supposed to be long-winded, so I thought we'd take way more time there, but you're also succinct. So we do have a couple of minutes, so we could wrap up early. I can pass it back to David, but I also maybe wanted to open it up, Rick or Allison or Laura, is there something that you wanted to talk about that you didn't get a chance to, a question that you wanted to ask each other or me or the Weekend Network? Yeah, just wanted to give you one last sort of moment to make a last point or ask a question.
Oh man, that's big. We could go on for hours. I've got one thing that I'd be interested to hear from Laura or Nadine, you in New West, which is about how you framed up the urgency of the issue, because we all went through that 2018, 2019 declarations, I guess 2019 declarations of climate emergency. And that was a big thing. And then we said, okay, well, that was step one. Step two is now action. Let's start putting our plans into place. And you saw municipalities that kind of didn't follow through. And I know there's a lot of reasons for that too. But did you have you been able to figure out how to talk to people about what this means? Like, what are we trying to achieve? What will that look like in terms of how you get around, how you heat your homes, you know, all of those kinds of things. How have you guys dealt with it in your cities?
Laura, do you want to answer?
I don't even know how to answer that, Rick. I'm not sure I have learned to deal with it. I guess back to what Allison said, you know, building relationships and staying rooted in the relationships. I think that's the only way, the only way to move forward. And on the first question, Nadine, when you said, was there anything that you wanted to add that you may not have talked about before? More of this, please. Like this tonight is a really important opportunity for people to kind of get a bit of a sense of what the work is like and get a bit of a snapshot of reality of what it's like from the perspective of someone who cares a lot about the climate issue on local government. And I hope we didn't scare anyone. I hope I didn't scare anyone away. But this is a really important opportunity, and I thank everyone for joining together tonight. And that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say in New West we have our response to the climate, because again, in a city, a crisis means nothing. Like, it doesn't actually mean anything. It's a symbolic gesture, but it doesn't require you to do anything. There's no mechanism that's triggered. And so you're absolutely right that the declaration was only as good as a plan that it relied on. And so we came up with the 7 bold steps. And so some of that was around like decarbonizing buildings, getting people out of single car vehicles, single vehicles. And then there was also a vision for like retaking back public space as well. And so something that I think it's like what you said about Megan's relentlessness is relentlessly asking for a positive framing of the crisis, of that this is an opportunity for us to have more public space, to have more trees, to have more community gatherings, and just really insisting, like, every chance that we talk about climate is how are we positively framing it. But I think it's also insisting towards staff every time that we get a chance is inserting climate in every conversation, just like, you know, we insert equity in every conversation, is just never, ever, ever talking about anything without being like, and 7 bold steps, and 7 bold steps, and how does that meet that? But also looking for a positive framing. And a lot of that work is not very glamorous, like updating your community energy and emissions plan. It's not like the public's like, oh boy, I can't wait to read that updated plan. They don't care. They're like, that's not exciting, as certain things like canceling pipelines, like, and rightfully so, that's exciting. So I think it's trying to, again, rely on the positive pieces of it so that you can get things like energy and emission plans updated. So yeah.
Something I'll add to that is that in the same perspective of applying a climate lens to everything, I think it's really important for policies and plans not to exist in silo from each other. Oftentimes we put forward a climate action plan, but do we look at existing policies that may be barriers to getting that work done? We put forward a housing plan, but how are we requiring the number and types and diversity of units that we say we need, that we have identified as a need, and making sure that developers are required to build it? Like, we need to take and apply our plans and look at all of our policies and make sure that they're all streamlined. And like Nadine said, it's not glamorous work, but it has to be done. And I think further to somebody's question in the Q&A, it's not the public's job to be watching council at every single meeting and trying to say, my councillors have not done this. We absolutely just need to help get the voices who are elected, who will do the job to the standards that the community deserves and that our climate needs. Also, I'll add that climate resiliency, and folks know this, but municipalities are on the hook to pay for climate response to floods, to infrastructure damage, to the heat wave responses, to the extreme cold temperature that we are experiencing also as a result of climate change. And the cost of not actioning now is going to be even more than spending preventatively now.
Thanks, Allison. It's such a good point. There's a huge financial disaster coming our way. And it's much cheaper and much more humane to deal with it now. So really nice. I haven't seen most of you folks in a while, especially you, Rick, being over in Nelson, but it's really nice to spend the evening with you and chat with you, and your hope for me as well, because I know that you're each in your own municipalities bringing this forward and being really visionary. So really exciting for me to get to spend the evening with you. I'll also put in a small plug that I'm a co-founder of an organization called Feminist Campaign School. If you're looking to run, we also support underrepresented people to get elected on progressive issues. So we have a website, feministcampaignSchool.ca. If you want to check it out, we'd be happy to support you with all our tools and resources. So I will pass it back to you, David. What is making you hopeful right now?
Oh, this conversation and the ideas in it, and some of the ideas in the chat too. And speaking of which, I just wanted to flag Amy Walker's point in the chat that it's Climate Strike Day tomorrow. And in Vancouver, it's going to be 4 to 6 at the Vancouver Art Gallery, but check out your own local climate strikes. Very thoughtful conversation. I'm really anticipating the video being uploaded. I'm going to have to go back and watch it again. On behalf of West Coast Climate Action Network, I'd like to thank our 3 panelists, Laura, Allison, and Rick, and our great moderator, Nadine, for sharing their time, knowledge, and experiences. And also thank all of you participants for your time and knowledge showing up in the comments and questions, and for making it worthwhile to put on this roundtable, and for your efforts. Thank you in advance for helping to elect climate champions and push municipal climate action. You can add your own thanks and parting messages in the chat. I noticed that Gail said, please consider having more of these sessions. They give me hope, which is great to hear. This is the 3rd of our roundtables, and the 4th one is coming, so save the date. It's scheduled for Wednesday, April 20th at 7 p.m. This one's going to be called Climate Crisis Campaign School, aka Municipal Campaigning 101. So we'll have a panel that'll share their perspectives on election strategies, how to organize a campaign, answering controversial climate change questions posed by the public. We had a little discussion of that tonight, and how to get your messages accurately reported by the press, and all sorts of related topics. So for details, watch our events page, which has a lot of climate events province-wide from We Can, but also from other organizations, often a few events per day. And if you have any suggestions, feedback, ideas, if you know of volunteers or want to volunteer or want to donate or anything else, contact us at the contact page on the website. So on behalf of We Can, thank you all again. Stay healthy, have a great night, and we'll see you at the next roundtable.